Hi, everyone. I am Josephine Balzac. I am here in sunny Orlando, Florida. I'm an assistant professor at Rollins College and also a licensed attorney. And I am more than honored to be able to moderate this panel with Congressman Ted Deutch. I really have looked up to him as a true climate leader for the state of Florida. He is a congressman that represents Broward and Palm Beach counties in the U.S. House of Representatives. He has earned a reputation as a Democrat willing to work across the aisle to get things done. Ted is the co-founder and co-chair of the Congressional Climate Solutions Caucus, the first bipartisan task force on climate change, bringing together Republicans and Democrats to discuss the wide impacts of climate change and develop economically viable policies to reduce climate risk. Ted introduced a major bipartisan bill to put a price on carbon that would help reduce emissions and return 100% of the net revenue back to the American people. He has passed legislation reauthorizing federal support for ocean-generated renewable energy research underway at institutions like Florida Atlantic University, and he helped secure federal funding for beach renourishment and Everglades restoration. So it is my honor and pleasure, without any further ado, Congressman Ted Deutch, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. In addition to the work I do on climate change, I'm a senior member of the judiciary, so I can't think of anything I'd rather do just minutes after the Mueller report came out than come focus on my other work that I do as well. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm happy to give you some thoughts or answer some questions. Would you like me to talk a little bit about what we do?
Yeah. If you want to go ahead and talk for some time,
Sure.
And then we'll have some questions.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate your highlighting some of what we're trying to do in Congress. There's obviously frustration with Congress's inability to really focus on taking action to combat climate change, but there are some encouraging developments. I started the Climate Solutions Caucus with my former colleague from down here in South Florida, Carlos Cabello. And the idea was that from our perspective, climate change isn't some issue that we're going to deal with next year or 10 years from now. We have to worry because it's going to impact us. For those of us who live in places like South Florida, where sunny day flooding as a result of sea level rise is happening right now, it was clear that action had to be taken. So we formed this Climate Solutions Caucus. We built it, I think, not surprisingly, using the Noah's Ark approach, given that we've got these flooding issues. 2 by 2, if you wanted to join as a Democrat or Republican, you had to bring someone from the opposite party with you. And we built it up to over 90 members. We lost a lot of those members in the last election, but we built it up, and we've used it as an opportunity to get together and have meetings and discussions with business leaders, with people from the energy world, with environmentalists, people who have been impacted directly by climate change, in order to highlight the need to take action right now. National security experts have a view that's extremely relevant in some parts of the country where there's a strong military presence. The renewable companies have a strong voice in other places, and everyone, whether you're in Florida dealing with the worst hurricanes that we've seen in recent history, or the sea level rise, or you're in the central part of the country facing storms and drought, or you're on the West Coast facing fires, all over the country, people understand that we have to take action. The Climate Solutions Caucus aims to bring people together to do that. This Congress, the goal is to actually focus on some specific tangible items that we can get done. I'm happy to talk about that. And then the only other thing I would just quickly mention is at a time when there is a lot of attention focused on the Green New Deal, and there's a lot of attention focused on this select committee in Congress that was formed to combat climate change, the only bipartisan effort thus far to really do something is our our Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, a piece of legislation that puts a price on carbon that would create over 2 million jobs in the next 10 years, would prevent 13,000 pollution-related deaths per year, and would reduce carbon output by 45% by 2030 and by over 90% by 2050. That's the kind of thing that we need to do in order to seriously address climate change. Nothing happens in Washington unless it's bipartisan. That's why we're taking this approach. And I'm just grateful that that at this moment, when there's so much at stake, that there are lawyers, practitioners all around the country who are dedicating themselves to this important work to bring about the change that's necessary.
Well, great. Thank you so much for introducing some of the topics that we absolutely want to talk about with you. So you did start with the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which I think is an amazing thing. I always talk about it with my students, and they're very much impressed because unfortunately climate change has been a highly politicized issue, but it should not be. So you did say that there were some specific tangible items that the caucus is working on. Can you speak further about some of those things?
Sure. I mean, we're looking at in the last Congress, we were able to block some efforts in the Defense Authorization Act that would have prevented the military from even considering climate change. That was a small victory, but we want to incentivize development and commercialization of renewable energy. That's something that has bipartisan support. The ARPA-E program at the Department of Energy, again, is something that has support. We want to help build more support for decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture is something that we think can be done in a bipartisan way. And the greening of cities, focusing on green infrastructure, is an issue that we hope to deal with right away. If we get to the point where there is a real infrastructure debate, and Democrats in Congress have said they want that, Republicans in Congress have said they want that, the president's talked about it. If we get to that point, we have to include green infrastructure as part of that discussion. Down here in Florida, Josephine, as you know, there are cities that are taking action. It costs a lot of money. That there's so much more that can be done if the federal government is willing to partner up. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in the near term, even as we continue to work on putting a price on carbon, which I think would be the most important and most dramatic step that we can take.
Yes, excellent. And I'm glad you brought up, Florida, because, we're here in Florida. I find it so incredible that you're so highly supportive of acting on climate change. But yet Florida has not fully embraced action on climate change, even though it seems, we're one of the most at risk, if not the most at risk state in the country. So how is it that you're so supportive on this issue?
Right. Well, not fully supportive, I think, is being generous to the state, to the state government. Look,
I agree.
We have our former governor, who's now a United States senator, who was a climate denier, who was so dedicated to standing in the way of meaningful action that he actually imposed a gag order so that you couldn't even talk about climate change. The current governor has, to his credit, has focused on some environmental issues. Everglades restoration seems to matter to the governor. Water quality is an issue that he's talking about, but on climate change, he was asked specifically about the role that humans play in contributing to climate change, and he wouldn't answer. Wanted to move on to the next topic. My hope is that because he's now going to have a science advisor, something that doesn't seem like it should warrant great acclaim for making that bold decision in Florida after the last governor. The fact that there's going to be someone who's offering real scientific advice at least gives me some hope that we might be able to try to push Tallahassee to acknowledge what those of us around the state know. The irony here is that in places like Tallahassee, in the state capital, and in the U.S. Senate, and in certain capitals around the country, this is still viewed as a partisan issue. But at the local level, in Florida and everywhere else, Democratic and Republican elected officials are all taking action because they know, their business communities know, that this is not about politics. It's about economic well-being, excuse me, and opportunities for the people who live in those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you briefly talked about, some of the flooding in South Florida. What risk does climate change pose to Florida, and specifically your districts there in South Florida, and how soon?
Well, I mean, it's a concern. It's a risk right now, both because of the intensity of hurricanes, the increased intensity in hurricanes, and because most immediately of sea level rise. When you see sunny day flooding during king tides, and you realize that the sea level rise here is dramatically higher than around the world, and you look at the environment we have, it's going to start to impact not just our daily lives and the convenience of being able to drive somewhere or walk somewhere or conduct business. It's going to make it, I mean, eventually, if we're not serious about this, it's going to impact the real estate economy in Florida. Insurance companies, mortgage companies are going to start making tough decisions about properties along the coast if they're worried about the rising sea level and the long-term implication that has. Once you start, I was a real estate lawyer for a long time before I started doing this, and once it becomes untenable to look at a 30-year time frame on a mortgage, you're necessarily going to see a negative impact on the real estate industry. So all of this is happening now. That's why it's so critical that the work we do be treated with the urgency that's required.
Yes, yes. So let's talk a little bit about the bill that you proposed, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act. Can you explain why you proposed the bill, and why has carbon pricing like this not happened already?
Sure. Well, the reason we proposed the bill is because it's one thing to talk about the need to do something, but you have to change behavior. And the way to change behavior is to put a price on carbon. What we've learned from talking to lots of people in the industry, including energy companies, including Fortune 100 companies, a lot of them are already putting a price on carbon internally in their economic forecasts. But if there's not an actual cost, then the behavior won't change. So Congressman Rooney and I introduced this bill to impose a strong price on carbon, $15 a ton, that would increase $10 a year until our emission goals are reached, in order to start to change behavior. And we think that it can be successful because of what we do with the money. There are other efforts. There have been other efforts to do a carbon fee, to take that money and to invest in infrastructure. That's a great goal, but politically, it's a lot easier if you simply treat it as a rebate. You impose this fee, and then the money that comes in is rebated to families across the country. It's going to wind up helping moderate income, low income households dramatically. And so we think politically there will be the will to do it.
Excellent. So that you kind of touched on it already. That was one of the questions from the audience is, what is the chance of this bill passing? What is the outlook? Are there going to be hearings on it shortly during this session, or in which committee?
Yes, we are. So we're trying to get a hearing in a committee. If not, the Climate Solutions Caucus, I think, will conduct its own public hearing.
Okay.
The difference between our caucus and the committees is that everyone who participates in the caucus wants to do something. We don't have deniers on the caucus, which is something that you see on frankly, on even the select committee to combat climate change. So we're going to do something. And just again, the difference, I just want to go back again, the difference between this and efforts that we've seen play out recently. I know my friend Governor Inslee was just on, and they're doing so much great work in Washington. The reason I think the ballot measure in Washington failed is because there too, they were going to take the revenue that came in and direct it to infrastructure. The ferry fleet was going to become electric. Those are all good ideas, but it was easier for the opponents to mischaracterize what they were trying to do. In France, we've been asked a lot. We've gotten questions about the yellow vests and the protests and the efforts there to combat climate change. They're using the money to pay down the national debt. Again, okay, it may be a worthy goal, but politically, it just becomes really hard when you start imposing a fee that's going to cost people more money, and then they don't see any benefit from it. That's why we think this is different.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And I think a lot of people don't know that the bill that you're proposing is actually trying to put money back in people's pockets, to really help the middle and low income Americans. And that's definitely something new and innovative. How can us as lawyers better support this bill?
You can help amplify the message, which is, you're particularly lawyers who are familiar with these issues, who understand that this is not just some effort to help the environment, which in and of itself would be sufficient, but that there's a real economic impact to doing this. That if we only have two choices. We can refuse to act, in which case we're going to see an undermining of economic development in our communities around the country and worsening storms and worse damage. Or we can take action that will help to address this and focusing on the one bipartisan effort, the first bipartisan effort to do something about climate change in decades, at a time when there is, I don't have to tell everyone on this conference, there is a very stark partisan divide. Why not use this opportunity to focus on an issue that matters for everyone, to highlight the bipartisanship that's necessary, and maybe we can move forward with this and use it as an example of the way things ought to be done in Washington.
So just in closing, we're really concerned about leaving a mess for our future, just as you are. What can we, not just specifically for the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, but in general, what can us as lawyers do to help get this problem solved in time to make a difference? And where and how should we direct our voices as advocates?
Well, given what you do, and given what you know, and the fact that you're so engaged around this issue, make every candidate in the presidential campaign prioritize this issue the way that Governor Inslee is. Don't allow the conversation, the political conversation, to push the issue of climate change off to the side as something that is for another day, or that isn't as important as some of the other issues that are being discussed. Look, I could argue that over the past few weeks, there's been more time spent talking about whether to increase the number of Supreme Court justices in the Democratic primaries than there has been on how to combat climate change. That's the problem, and it's voices like yours that are well educated and that understand what's at stake here, who can help ensure that this issue is front and center. It's not easy, but it's essential that we act, and we know what will happen if we don't. And as you point out, for us, for our kids, for our grandkids, there's just one opportunity to get this right, and this is it. And so let's make sure everyone's talking about it.
Thank you so much. We have about a minute to spare. Do you have anything to say in closing? We really do appreciate you joining us here today. And I know you're at the airport, and so we really appreciate your time.
Well, no, I appreciate it. I would be remiss if I didn't take advantage of the opportunity to encourage you to reach out to your elected officials and tell them to be supportive of this legislation. They need to hear, again, they need to hear from you, and because of the strength of your voices and the level of your expertise. So I'd encourage people to do that too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.